So today, as a first lecture, we will discuss the Bodhisattva way. And in this lecture, what I hope to transmit to you is that many of us here are seasoned practitioners and have done basic Buddhist research. So I think a lot of us may assume that we understand the Bodhisattva and the way of the Bodhisattva. What I would like to show today is the basic standard idea of Bodhisattva, and then in relation to our practice, especially the Lotus Sutra, which I believe shows that our specific way of the Bodhisattva, which is quite different than some of the other sutras, as well as you'll see other worlds. So in Buddhism, we have to think in a universal idea that not just this world, but actually many worlds and universes that also include practitioners of Buddhism. So Buddhism is a universal teaching that goes beyond just this world. So please keep that in mind as I explain this. So as we know, there are the main two schools. We have the Theravada and the Mahayana. The Mahayana is more associated with the idea of the Bodhisattva. So if you go to most Mahayana schools, they will say they follow the way of the Bodhisattva. And so to give a basic definition of the Bodhisattva, everyone is encouraged to follow the Bodhisattva way, but that in some traditions they have something called even the Bodhisattva vows, which we in our practice use at the end of our service. So if you turn, please open your blue book. To the Four Great Vows, page 78. Now, this is an interesting point on page 78. I'd like you to show you this idea, because these are the basic great vows of the Bodhisattva. Now, there's a reason why when we chant it, we don't chant the first part, that sentient beings are innumerable, I vow to save them all. And the explanation that I was given is because actually this is the Buddha's vow. And then we repeat the three after that. Our defilements are inexhaustible, I vow to quench them all. The Buddha's teachings are immeasurable, I vow to know them all. The way of the Buddha is unexcelled, I vow to attain the path sublime. Now, in understanding the way of the Bodhisattva, it's very important that those last two lines, the way and the path, because these are very important words in the definition of the concept of the Bodhisattva. And most exclusively, as you know, the Four Noble Truths, the fourth Noble Truth in Theravada Buddhism being the Eightfold Path, in the Mahayana tradition is considered the Sixth Paramita. And the Sixth Paramita is used as a basic guide for the practice of bodhisattvas. So the six paramita are basically a kind of, condensing, or another way of explaining, according to Mahayana concepts, the Eightfold Path in a more general, more direct way. So once again, the idea of bodhisattva, the bodhisattva's most, important part of their practice is their vow. And as we see the four great vows, a bodhisattva who has a determination to free all sentient beings from samsara, which is the idea of suffering, and it's the cycle of birth and death, rebirth and suffering. And the main idea of the bodhisattva is something called the bodhicitta, or the idea of the awakening or aspiration, coming through the idea of compassion to others. That one then takes up these bodhisattva vows in order to progress together with others on a spiritual path towards Buddhahood. And that in actuality, the attainment of Buddhahood in the bodhisattva way is through the way of the Buddha and the path. And that is, of course, with others. So Mahayana is seen as a big vehicle, a large vehicle, the great vehicle that can include many different types of people, many people. and that the Bodhisattvas learn their enlightenment and see their enlightenment at a higher level because they use compassion. So as we know in the 10 states of mind or the 10 realms, the Shavakas or the Prataki Buddhas who practice for themselves or are direct students of the Buddha in the Theravadan frame of mind or Theravadan practice, they do it's most exclusively for themselves, that they do it for their own enlightenment. And that the main difference between those realms and the realm of the Bodhisattva is the awakening of compassion. Now, compassion, if you look up compassion in the dictionary, in the English sense, it says empathy. But it's very important to understand the concept of Buddhist compassion, which is quite different. Buddhist compassion is made up of two characters. One is ji, which can be considered empathy. So that is the usual concept that people have of the idea of enlightenment. That I can feel your suffering. Your suffering reflect. I can have the emotional awareness and emotional sensitivity to feel your happiness or sadness. This is also the definition of humanity, and is actually the trademark between humanity and, for instance, the animal or primitive mind. So therefore, empathy is a very important human characteristic in that definition. But Buddhism adds another character after that, he. And he actually means to take action to relieve suffering. So basically, that's why it's very important that you equate bodhisattva with action. And not only action for oneself, but compassionate or empathetic action for all people. So actually, Tsukamoto Sensei speaks directly to say, being in other people's shoes. And so therefore, being in other people's shoes, we as practitioners cannot carry other people's burden, but we can shoulder it. So therefore, that's why it says the way, the path, that we walk together arm in arm, both with the Buddha as well as all sentient beings. And that our enlightenment is actually an interdependent enlightenment. That means your enlightenment is necessary for my enlightenment. And that enlightenment is not separate according to each being. That this is the basic concept of Buddhism, the interdependence, that there is an interdependent enlightenment. And that we all move forward towards that enlightenment. But again, that can be very inspiring, but also can be very vague to a lot of people, I feel. So the definition of bodhisattva is, of course, is portrayed as a more noble adventure because it's considerate of others and it's not just about your own personal awakening or satisfaction or removal of suffering. But actually, Mahayana Buddhism says that in reality, you can't remove your suffering as long as there is suffering in other people, other beings. So this interdependence idea is extremely critical in understanding the difference. However, we learn in the Lotus Sutra, and this is why we're going to go to our main text, and this will also show you why the Lotus Sutra is so important in Buddhism, because it actually gives us a definition, and a very specific definition of what it means to be a bodhisattva. Because there are bodhisattvas, now once again, this universal idea, there are bodhisattvas connected with other sutras, other practices, other worlds. But then again, within our context, this world, the Buddha gives us the Lotus Sutra and the bodhisattvas of this world. So we have a more concrete example of what our mission is. Because when we talk about the bodhisattva mission, when you have a mission, it's very important to have intel and details of what you should be doing. So just to say to practitioners, all right, your mission is to be empathetic and remove the suffering of other people. Okay, how is that done and in what context? How do I, as a non-perfected being, and that's another aspect of the bodhisattva, you haven't attained the level of Buddhahood yet. But that actually, which we'll see in the Lotus Sutra, Buddhahood is contained in the path of the Bodhisattva because of the action. So as a lot of times when people look at the idea of enlightenment, or the idea of Buddhahood, it's very passive. It's almost as if when you attain enlightenment, you then take a vacation for the rest of your life. You don't feel anything and you just sit on the beach all day. But actually, Buddhism, which is exemplified in the Lotus Sutra, shows us specific action and exemplified through our founder Nichiren Shonin's action, which is quite different. A different revelation to the idea of enlightenment, a more realistic revelation to enlightenment, that it gives us a very clear picture of what that means. So, let me see here. Do all of you have your Lotus Sutra with you? If you could, please open your Lotus Sutra to page 65. Now, a different idea that I feel that is in the Lotus Sutra. Now, does everyone have a basic concept of the idea of Bodhisattva, as I explained? Okay. It's interesting because remember what I said, Bodhisattva is that Bodhisattva vow. That's how most Buddhists consider Bodhisattva, that they gain a certain level of empathetic enlightenment, that the idea that they realize, okay, I feel for you, and that actually I care for you, so I'm going to make a vow, I'm going to stave off my perfect vacation, my perfect enlightenment to go and help you. Isn't that wonderful? But actually, in the Lotus Sutra, it's interesting because vow is not necessarily enough. There's one aspect which our Buddhism particularly has, which when I first came from the other tradition of Buddhism, I didn't quite understand. So if you go to page 65, the middle of the second stanza of the paragraph there, those who receive the Dharma by faith. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines down. Those who receive the Dharma by faith after hearing it from the Buddha, the world-honored one, who strenuously seek the knowledge of all things, the wisdom of the Buddha, the self-originating wisdom, the wisdom to be obtained without teachers, the insight and powers and fearlessness of the Tathagata, who give peace to the innumerable living beings out of their compassion towards them, and who benefit gods and men. That's again carrying on from yesterday. That is to say, who save all living beings are called men of the great vehicle. Bodhisattvas are called Mahasattvas because they seek this vehicle. Now, the next part is very interesting because they may be likened to the children who left the burning house in order to get the bullock carts. So it's interesting. Now everyone knows chapter 3, the parable with the burning house. So everybody knows that parable. So the idea, now a very concrete example is that the idea of bringing people out of this burning house. Now, when we look at that, we see the Father as the Buddha. But actually, the device he uses to bring the people out of the burning house is the same device as the Bodhisattva, to save sentient beings. So what that means is that we, when I was, I used to be a volunteer fireman. And so this story makes a lot of sense because sometimes I've really realized, actually when people's houses are on fire, people think about all the stuff that's inside. They think about pets, etc. like that. And so a lot of times, in order to kind of expiate or expedite to have people come out, sometimes you had to think of very, creative ways that could seem kind of untruthful. But in reality, the result was they thank you after going, oh, thank you for saving my life. I guess that stuff wasn't as important. And then usually we have their pet, go inside and help it find the pet, etc. So it's very reality based in the idea that this concept of how, now that we may consider ourselves or model ourselves as bodhisattvas, but how do we implement the bodhisattva way? A lot of times Buddhism, especially Buddhism as it's presented, and I'd like to make a sermon someday, the problem with Buddhism is that Buddhism is portrayed as optimal circumstance practice. So therefore, and a lot of times, Buddhism is usually portrayed as a reclusive practice, an ascetic practice, a kind of, how would you say, like a clerical practice, just because basically all of you should aspire to become clergy, shave your heads someday, wear robes. But in actuality, the way of the Bodhisattva is not that. It's not even contained in the idea of even the monastic form of Buddhism, that it's in the everyday form, and it can be practiced anywhere and in any situation. So the idea that the burning house shows us is the immediacy of that, is that this world, this house, all of this, there are people in danger. There are people in suffering. And what needs to be done is we need to take action. And how do we take action? Where do we get our instructions from? That is the Lotus Sutra. And if you look at even the other Mahayana sutras, they're about certain intellectual or spiritual concepts. But to me, when I first read the Lotus Sutra, I was kind of confused because it was different than all the other sutras I had read, where all the other sutras gave precepts. So if you followed these precepts, you were a bodhisattva. If you followed if you understood the spiritual concept of emptiness, etc., you were a bodhisattva. Those were all prerequisites. But actually, the Lotus Sutra is specifically about action. You see suffering, therefore, through your action, which is where faith is derived, faith grows, then you're able to have the strength and fortitude and also teaching to do the correct thing. And that's where you receive the teaching from the Buddha. It's manifested in the action of the Bodhisattva. So, whereas most Buddhism is passive until they attain the enlightenment that they need, Bodhisattva way is action-oriented, which means even in the idea that you may be unenlightened, but actually the simple act of having pure compassion and the action of relieving suffering is a certain level of enlightenment, which they consider the highest level of enlightenment. So when I was a monk, it was interesting. They had so many levels of enlightenment that even the idea of arahat, which actually with this body is impossible to attain, because one of them is you just stop eating. That doesn't really work when you have a human body. So, and you stop sleeping and you stop doing all of that. So in reality, those things, unless you lose this body, seems very much unattainable to me, even though there were people who said they had attained it. I had some questioning about that. But in the reality, the action in and of itself, the vow, but the path and the faith which is grown from it, which is exemplified through Nichiren Shonin, is the way of the Bodhisattva. So therefore, this concept of faith, I'd like to look at that for a moment, because that was one of my biggest issues with the Lotus Sutra, because I had specifically practiced Buddhism because I dislike the idea of faith-based or religion. Terribly disliked it, because faith to me was just so creative in that you could believe whatever you want, make up any story or any idea to make yourself feel better about your life or the world. And that I really liked Buddhism because it's based in a reality. Now, the faith in Buddhism is very different than the faith that you find in other religions. There is a passive faith and there is an active faith. That's the major difference. Passive faith is when you believe something because you just accepted what I had to say about it, or I wrote a book, and the book happens to be old, so people believe in it. It's kind of funny because when you look at it, it's interesting. I watched this TV show called Pawn Shop in the United States. And a lot of times people bring in old stuff all the time, and they're like, this is 100 years old. And the person goes, just because it's old doesn't mean it's worth anything. That might have sentimental value to you, but it doesn't mean it's worth anything. So a lot of times people are very disappointed, but I saved this for 100 years. It's like, well, it's not worth very much. So a lot of the religious context for people, just because your book is very old or that people have believed it for a long time, doesn't make it true and doesn't make it worth very much. So in my idea is that in the Buddhism, the idea, the specific idea of faith is that, and why the Lotus Sutra is quite different, is that this is faith learned in action, and that faith is derived on your active participation. So faith is a personal experience, not a passive experience, in that the idea, we get to see that the Buddha exists in our actions, in that our vow and the path exists. Because a lot of times I realize, beginning Buddhism, you have a structured path, right? That's why people take meditation courses or go sit in zendos or whatever the people decide to do in these structured programs, that, okay, this is Buddhism. But actually, the reality of Buddhism is that in every moment, so we have the concept of Ichinen Sanzen, that every moment there is infinite potential to realizing enlightenment. And that enlightenment is contained in every moment. So that we are active participants of the Bodhisattva way. So when we simply abide in the mind of the Bodhisattva, we are gaining the information. Our Buddha seed is growing. So Tsukamoto Sensei used to show a circle. And, yesterday was talking about anger and hate in our mind, that it's kind of taking up the space. And how do you nourish the Buddha seed? Yesterday he talked about Buddha nature, right? Which was really a great sermon. But how do you nourish Buddha nature? Do you nourish Buddha nature simply through sitting meditation? Or do you simply do it by believing in something? Or do you do it by simply following precepts? And the Lotus Sutra said, no, the actualization of the precepts, the actualization of the enlightenment is in the practice of the Bodhisattva, as portrayed in the Lotus Sutra. Now, my concept that I would like to share with you is that the Lotus Sutra more specifically shows the true way of the Bodhisattva, a more deeper concept. Let's see here. And that concept is explained in the Bodhisattvas from Underground chapter. So if you go to page 232, please. At the very top. Now, yesterday I was speaking about specifically about the mindset that the person, we were talking specifically about how anger destroys the mindset, and that we kept going back to the armor of endurance, and that actually this word kept coming up. If you look at the second line, they are resolute in mind. That means faith in Buddhism. That means vow. So faith and vow are actually interconnected in our Buddhist practice. The faith that we have is that the Buddha attained enlightenment, and that we can experience that momentarily every moment in our lives as we chant the Odaimoku. It's growing and it's being manifested in our lives. And then they will have a great power of patience. So this came over and over, this concept of patience. Think of me and be patient. Wear the armor of endurance. That concept of patience is very much the concept of the Bodhisattva. Because when we're looking at anger, you have two options to dealing with other beings. You can see other beings as separate than yourself, so therefore you despise them. Because when I was a monk, practicing for myself, I looked at other people and said, what is wrong with them? Why are they so lazy? Why are they not so interested in attaining enlightenment? I was actually angry about that, because it was, to me, why wouldn't you want to change your life? But then again, that is a lack of compassion, because suffering can be very confusing in the sense that some people have given up the idea of even that there's anything to attain but suffering. Where people are like, okay, this is all that there is. You just pay taxes and die. That's all I have to look forward to. Because, when people, that old saying, there are only two security definites in life, and that is taxes and death. This great idea of patience, And that we see this exemplified. And this is why Nichiren Shonin is so important. Is because he is an exemplary example of patience. In that he did not give up on any beings, including the beings who attacked him. He used the armor of endurance, and endurance is denoting patience. That maybe even you take a few blows for the other person till they realize, I give up. Or that you remove that, or in some way endure. And that actually through the idea of endurance, of compassion, means understanding of suffering. Because I realized when I began to practice Nichiren Buddhism, my mind changed from that mind of dislike of other sentient beings. Even though I claim to be a Bodhisattva. I'm practicing for you, really. I am. But actually I can't stand you. But in the idea of the Lotus Sutra that was saying, I have a patience to see we are same. And also I have the patience to wait for you. That is a pretty big statement, to wait for you. And even to be here for you. Because in actuality, there's two realities of it. I've been studying for a long time about life coaching. And most people in our nature, especially your spiritual people, right? So one of our, and also strong people, we have a tendency to want to fix things for people. We have a tendency to want to take care of things for people because we may be able to. But in actuality, one thing my teacher said that made me it just cleared the whole thing up for me. We can't carry anyone's load, but we can shoulder the burden. And the more people that are shouldering the burden, the more easier it is to walk the path. But each person's enlightenment is connected to each person, but it's a co-op of enlightenment. It's a conglomerate of enlightenment. So this concept to me was very important because I said, as a bodhisattva, in my idea of saving people is not to smack them upside the head and go, wake up people, time to get with it. But patience, in order for this to grow and to sink in. And patience to me is the perfect example of compassion. Because I've never seen impatient compassion, in that way. Compassion meaning patience. You too have the ability. You too will become a Buddha. That is exemplified in the chapter. Again, never disparaging or never despising Bodhisattva. Which Nichiren Shonin, of course, modeled himself after. So no matter what we have to take in this world, because we are strong, because we are resolute in mind, as it says, resolute in mind. Take that apart. Resolute means you don't have any misunderstanding about what your mission is in life. You don't have any misunderstanding of what really is going on here, and that you are confident. That is the example of faith. That confidence is faith in Nichiren Buddhism. So it's not something that you just, a passive faith, you just believe in something. We are resolute in faith. We are resolute in mind. We have a purpose. And when that bigger purpose is part of who you are, it changes your life, changes other people's life. And that's how we can improve the world. So actually, I say to people, when people tell me politics will change the world, when people tell me religion will change the world, when people will tell me all this other stuff will change the world, magic will change the world, all of that stuff, I said no. Actually, real reality is the way of the Bodhisattva, to be resolute in mind, in the idea of enlightenment and that Buddha nature, as Komoto Sensei was explaining yesterday. So all living beings are glad to see them. So that means when you are patient, you become a good friend. So in Buddhism, there are many references to the good friend or the good practitioner. One who practices with you, one that doesn't take away your enlightenment, your experience. So as Nichiren Shonin's writings you can see, Nichiren Shonin also that faith is not something that you just gain. It's something that's constantly growing. And at every moment of my life, when somebody said, well, what's the purpose, what's the greatness about the Lotus Sutra? What's the great principle or purpose or experience of the Lotus Sutra? And I said, the freedom to go anywhere. And also that every moment I feel I'm learning something. That the way that I actually realize enlightenment is not an end. Enlightenment is a constantly moving, constantly growing, constantly awakening experience. And that it is, as Ichinen Sanzen shows us, in every moment. So, the idea of the Lotus Sutra, the concept of the Bodhisattva is quite different. Because if you look at the Lotus, here, it's interesting. The Bodhisattvas, if you look on page 233, this talks about it again. 1, 2, 3. These Bodhisattvas have great powers, virtues, and energy. And that this is the concept of us. And the idea of faith is, if you look on page 232, 1, 2, 3, 4, the last line, now they protect and keep the sutra. Uphold, keep the sutra. Rely upon the sutra. That actually the way of precepts or the way of morality that people talk about is manifested not in the thought, not in the necessary, taking on of the precept, but the practice of the precept by keeping the sutra. So it says here constantly, by upholding the sutra, you're upholding all of the precepts of the Bodhisattva. You're upholding the mission of the Bodhisattva. You're upholding the mind of the Bodhisattva. And the idea is that in the Bodhisattvas from underground, the Bodhisattvas, as I was saying, this universal concept, that there are Bodhisattvas everywhere in every universe, but that the Lotus Sutra is manifested in this world by the Bodhisattvas rising up from underground. And of course, the main leader, which is of course the manifestation of that the Nichiren Shonin, emanation kind of attributed his practice to, was Jogyo Bosatsu, the never despising. That again is patience. Never despair. Great superior practice Bodhisattva. In the idea that his practice is superior because of his vow, because of his compassion, because of his innate patience. And it was interesting because one of the core concepts in patience is nonviolence, which we see in Nichiren Shonin's life. But the fact that the Lotus Sutra comes from this earth means that it is specifically taught, this way of the Bodhisattva is for this world. So if you think of the many kinds of Bodhisattvas, when they asked, they come to the Buddha and say, please give us a sutra, we'll practice it, we'll teach it. He says, no. This is from Bodhisattvas from this world, specifically. So therefore, when we practice the way of the Bodhisattva, based on the concept of the Lotus Sutra, we realize that it is based in this world. It is based in this experience of being alive. And is not something that is to be attained after death or after enlightenment. But the actual true enlightenment is found within the action, within the empathetic action, the awareness that other people have the same same ability that we do to attain enlightenment. And one person that I've always been, it's a offshoot of Nichiren Shu, the Nippon Zanmyo Hoji. Now I believe they've lost a little bit of their strength because they're a little different than their teacher. They focus basically on peace. But actually the Lotus Sutra itself is the core. And Nichidatsu Fuji was a Nichiren Shu priest who then became the former of the Nippon Zanmyo Hoji. And he specifically said, we are born into the transitory world of humans. However, when we chant the Odaimoku, whether temporarily or in the dreams, if we believe in the words of Nichiren Shonin, we are ourselves one of the Bodhisattvas who emerge from the earth. In a world entrenched in evil, in the era of the declining law, the Bodhisattvas who emerge from the earth are entrusted with the mission to transform our Shaba, which is basically Saha, or this land of endurance, this world, into a pure land. The Daimoku is hard to chant if not for the advent of the Bodhisattvas who had emerged from the earth. Nichiren Shonin firmly believed in these words of his. We too must believe them. When this can be done, no matter how foolish we may be in flesh, that's a very important part because we are flesh. We have to remember that. We are able to chant the Odaimoku, which is to spread by Bodhisattva superior practice to bring peace to our domain and its people in the turmoil era of the declining law or the declining dharma. That is what proves the advent of the Bodhisattvas who emerge from the earth. As long as we chant the Odaimoku, we must have unfaltering faith in the true Dharma. The nourishment, the base of the Bodhisattva practice is faith. Must have unfaltering faith in the true Dharma of Risho Ankoku. That means through the true teaching we can establish true peace, true enlightenment, true serenity, and be well prepared to extricate the people from the afflictions of this world. The Lotus Sutra prepares us. The Lotus Sutra nourishes us. The Lotus Sutra supports us in this action. Without that, we would be lost into ourselves. We would be lost into our ego. And the inexplicable blessings of the Odaimoku can be appreciated if we consider that to be the mission that brought us to this world, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. When we ponder on the intent of Lord Buddha leaving the Odaimoku for the present era of the declining Dharma, and the significance of Nichiren Shonin appearing in this world, what are we to do but chant the Odaimoku, which is hard to do except for the retinue of the Bodhisattvas who emerge from the earth. We must bring liberation from the sufferings of this world and shed light on its darkness as shown in the teachings of Risho Ankoku. And Risho Ankoku, once again, is being able to establish peace through the correct teachings. Of course, coming from Nichiren Shonin's work, the Risho Ankoku Ron. Now, this explains what we are to do, how we are to do it, and what is our guide, and what is our standard. So that is why when I teach about the Bodhisattva, my job as a Bodhisattva is to be an exemplary of the Lotus Sutra. However, the Lotus Sutra stands on its own. This is our core. And that actually, to become a Bodhisattva, especially to recognize and, actualize you are a Bodhisattva from earth, you need this teaching. And the other part of the Lotus Sutra, which is different than other sutras, it's not to be practiced by yourself. Other sutras are private practices. Lotus Sutra is a universal practice, but specifically for this world, the Saha world. So when I see people, the first thing I say to them is that they want to say, I want to practice Buddhism. I myself am of limited capacity. Okay? Sometimes my brain doesn't work, sometimes it works. Sometimes I can remember things, sometimes I can't remember things. But actually, the Lotus Sutra says that even if you can't, it supports you. It's amazing that actually if I can't remember something, Chanta Daimoku, then it comes to me. The Buddha, this wish-fulfilling gem brings to my mind what is proper. And it's not coming from my intellect. It's coming from what we call our spidey sense, which is our Buddha nature sense. That it reveals to me, because if you look at what Tsukumoto Shinto is saying, that action is teaching, that through action we learn ourselves and others learn. And that only through action can we learn and follow the path of Buddhism, of the Lotus Sutra, of the Bodhisattvas from underground. That without action we are simply pretending. We're simply acting. But in reality, that does nothing for ourselves or for others. So when I see people and I want to spread the Dharma, not only do I teach them, as he was saying, the nourishment you need is the Daimoku. But to say to them, get a Lotus Sutra, read the Lotus Sutra. And even though it's hard, and even though it doesn't make any sense to you, because the first time I read the Lotus Sutra, this Lotus Sutra, exact one, when I was a monk, I had read the Lotus Sutra with commentary. Basically you would read chapter 1 and then there'd be commentary. So I had core concepts of the Lotus Sutra, but it never impacted me because I was simply parroting somebody else's concepts. But that is not really action, right? That's again passive. I'm just taking information and reiterating it or regurgitating it for other people. So actually, when I read the Lotus Sutra, this was very frustrating when I first read it, and that I was getting really annoyed with it because I was like, okay, I'm a monk, so I need to know what this means. So I was simply learning for learning's sake instead of actually cultivating myself. So when I was reading it, I had to deal with this because in reality, this must go into my body. This must be my standard. This must be my core. And that's why they call it the hidden core of the Dharma. That's why I like that, the idea of core training. So when we talk about core training, if you can do martial arts for a long time, but if you don't have a strong core, you can tell. You can just push the person over. So core is very important. Consider this like boot camp of Buddhism, right? Core training right here. Great abs in 30 days, So when you're reading, I tell people, grab the Lotus Sutra. And even though, because what's the one thing that has been, as I was saying, the word that we've been holding on to and been bringing up. What was that word? Patience. You have to have patience to go through this. Because it's like pulling teeth for some people because of people's arrogance and people's ego. It makes you blind. That when I first read the sutra, I couldn't even get my eyes to focus on the page. I was so annoyed. And that I was like, I don't get it. Because this is not like any other sutra I've read, which tells me, okay, be nice. Don't kill. Can do that. Try not to lie. If you lie and you break this rule, say you're sorry and, have a counsel with somebody else. Okay, I can do that. Those are rules. But that again is parroting. That is not manifesting. We as Nichiren Buddhists manifest our practice. We don't pretend our practice. So that's why the cool thing about Nichiren Buddhism is we can even understand, if you look at the Bodhisattvas from underground, right? Which you look at your juzu, how many little beads do you have here? 4. Were those Bodhisattvas all named the same? No. They had different attributes, different characters. Which is actually interesting because if you look at most of the way people interpret Buddhism, I'm very Zen. Means I don't talk, and sometimes if you talk to me, I make fun of you intellectually, and I become very good at it. But actually, that is not so compassionate. So as a Buddhist, I realized my character is going to come out, and my character is different than other people, but so is your character, and your attributes and your ability to help people, to encourage people, may be totally different than mine. But it's important. And that I say to people, your personality, your character is an integral part of this puzzle we call enlightenment. That each piece is essential. Each piece is essential. And if you look at most of the traditions in the world, you're not essential. Whatever is being worshipped is essential. But actually, we are essential. And that the way of the Bodhisattva is not only what manifests the Buddha's teaching, but shows the reality of the Buddha's teaching. Because as it said, without us, there is no Buddha. Without Buddha, there is no us. Interdependent nature. and that our lives are significant. Our purpose is significant. Our mission is significant and extremely important. That is why at our temple, and what we tried to say, Ankyoji Temple, the way I took from Tsukamoto Sensei, our mission is simply to be patient and spread the teachings of the Lotus Sutra by our abilities, our means, and to constantly cultivate it. Because one thing I realized, the way I teach all of my members, learning is doing. So they don't have to wait until they get the special medal from me or something to go out and teach the Dharma. If it's not correct, the way you teach the Dharma, this will balance you out. The Daimoku, as it says, what does Nichiren Shonin say? Chanting the Daimoku is like a snake going into a tube. Naturally straighten you out. So it's not my job to straighten you out. The Daimoku does it naturally. And that is why that is the core nutrition, the core concept of our practice. So I encourage all of you to understand how great your mission is. And when you meet people, exemplify Buddhism. And when they say, well, what's different than you? Because if you truly practice Buddhism, people will see something's different. And they will say, why is it different? Resolute in mind means there's no ifs, ands, or buts where that comes from. Well, I inherited from my parents, my mother. She's a very nice person, and my father is very patient. Maybe I get it from... No, we get it from the Buddha. So all of those other things are, influence on our life. But at the core concept of the Buddha, the core concept of the Bodhisattva is the Lotus Sutra. So encourage people to chant the Daimoku and read the Lotus Sutra. Now, with saying that, just a technique. Tell them to start, and this is Komoto Sensei kind of blew my mind that you could do this, because we get stuck in this idea of you must read from chapter 1 to chapter 28. No, start at chapter 10. Because actually that is the first time talk about the idea of men, like a lay people. So that is easier to understand. Go from 10 to 28 and then go back to 1. Because actually 1, which we consider boot camp, if you can get past chapter 1, you can do a lot of stuff. I think you can even bench about 200 pounds if you can get past chapter 1. I mean, yeah, most people are like, it's enough to make your eyes go cross, So therefore, important that we understand and cultivate. And this again is a transmission. This is a cultivation of how we can successfully fulfill our mission. So therefore, I hope someday we can have the Lotus Sutra available in a more available situation, not the $40 a piece. I would like to see it more easily that we could transmit to people. But the other way of transmitting is just transmitting the Daimoku, Namu-myoho Renge-kyo, which is our fuel for our mission. And also it's important, I wrote an essay for all of my members, filling your missionary tank, right? That the idea we need to have our missionary tank filled sometimes. And how does that happen? With others. So the concept, and a very important concept of that is, as the large vehicle, as a large mind, or the one vehicle that is taught in the Lotus Sutra that includes all beings, is big enough, that takes a lot of gas. So therefore, we are the people who collect the gas. We are the ones that fill the tank with our energy, with our actions. And without that, the car's not going anywhere. See? That's one of the concepts that people miss. So the Lotus Sutra practice is to be practiced with other people, not by yourself. This is not a solitary practice for your own edification of thinking how smart or how great you are. Because in reality, the greatness is simply in the mission, in the vow, in the faith, and in the patience, which is all manifested in your life. So if you see people who are angry, actually to sit down and talk to them, and years of psychology, if you're growing up in that, like myself, anger is default. But when you replace it with the Lotus Sutra, as I said, myself, I cannot overcome anger by myself. I realized that. And all the practices of Buddhism that I did, that seed was still there. So anger just sometimes got more angry because I saw people as more stupid and more lazy, because I then judged them from where I was. But in reality, that is not true. So the idea of patience allowed me to be patient with myself, and therefore that's how I become happier myself. Because what's the purpose of being hard on yourself unless you get some result? So therefore, very important, like any good workout, like any good martial arts practice, you have the correct teaching. You have the correct base. So therefore, this Lotus Sutra, keep with you at all times. Encourage others to pick it up. So when people say to me, how do I practice Buddhism? 3 things I tell them. Come to the temple. Get yourself a copy of the Lotus Sutra. And chant the Daimoku. That's it. That's how you see a change in the person. Coming to Buddhism 101, yeah, when they're ready, because inquiry is driven by that faith, that thirst. But actually, just to say I want to learn something is just another class in your undergraduate degree that you forget about and can't do after 5 or 6 years. You forget all the concepts. But this is a life concept. Okay? Any questions? So mission is what the Bodhisattva vow is all about. That is where our faith is manifested. So don't forget that. So if you are not spreading the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, that is not the way of the Bodhisattva. That is your way, your standard, and your comfort. But in reality, you cannot gain enlightenment by that way. The way is interacting with others and being able to learn from others. That is the humbleness and patience of the Lotus Sutra. Okay? All right.